Now that we know basically where the skin is and what it does, let's talk about the layers of the epidermis. The first layer, the deepest layer is the stratum basale. The stratum basale, and basal should imply it's bottom. It's adjacent to the basement membrane, right? This is the first layer, and it is only one layer thick. So if you look at the slide to the left, here's your basement membrane. Just this, what's in between my green lines, is your stratum basale. Okay? These are also known as basal cells. So when you hear the term basal cell carcinoma, it refers to a cancer of just this layer of skin. They are cuboidal in shape. Now, I'm going to scratch that off because it's a little misleading in hindsight. So the deepest layer of skin is cuboidal looking. And cells get flatter as they move or migrate superficially. Okay, so you start off with big bubbly cells down at the bottom, and then you notice these are a little flatter, and then these are a little flatter, and then you have kind of this hard line, and then here you can just sort of see that there's layers, but it's hard to even make out individual cells. Right? The stratum basale attaches to the dermis directly by way of that lamina propria and basement membrane, and this layer of cells has easy access to nutrients. So remember, epithelium, all epithelium, including the epithelium of your epidermis, is avascular, but it is innervated. So epithelium is avascular. There's no blood vessels in the skin, in any epithelium. But there is in connective tissue. So when you have epithelium adjacent to connective tissue, those cells can be fed by connective tissue capillaries. So when you look at the slide to the left here, you see the dermis, which is everything below this green line. You see these little squiggles around here, and there's little purple dots. That's cross sections of capillary beds. So you have capillaries very, very, very close to the superficialmost aspect of your connective tissue, and those nutrients can diffuse up and be consumed by your basal cells. In addition, your basal cells only have to get rid of their waste across a short distance to go and be whisked away by the bloodstream. Nutrients have to diffuse through all of these layers. And as you can imagine, the further away you go from the dermis, the less the cells can be fed, the worse their access is to the bloodstream. The closer you are, the more you get from the bloodstream. Cells of the stratum basale include keratinocytes, melanocytes, dendritic cells, and Merkel cells. Keratinocytes make keratin. That was that toughening, waterproofing molecule we talked about before. It has like a waxy kind of a feel to it. Melanocytes make melanin. Dendritic cells are immune cells. I will always refer to them as dendritic cells. That's the more modern term. But, excuse me, you'll find this term a lot, Langerhans cells, and you should be familiar with it. You'll still see it fairly frequently. A lot of terms in anatomy were historically named for the old white dude who claims to have discovered these cells or these structures or whatever. And they name them after themselves. So you have a lot of things in your body that have people's names. But that's not really helpful. To know that, the Langerhans cell is called a Langerhans cell doesn't really tell you anything about the cell. So in recent years, we've gone away from using those people's names. They'll be credited in textbooks and stuff. When you read about the cells, they'll say it was discovered by so-and-so. But in actually referring to them, we start to use more anatomical terms where we talk about the shape or the function of the cell. Finally, we also have Merkel cells, which are nerve ending cells. Basically, they're nerve cells. They help pick up sensation from the world. Now let's look a little more closely at the keratinocytes. Most of the cells in your basal in your basal cell layer are keratinocytes. So most. Okay, you take a look at this diagram over here. You have a melanocyte right here, and it has these branchy arms. We'll talk about that in a bit. You have a Merkel cell, which is sort of a cell that's adjacent to a nerve. And you have these basal cells, which are keratinocytes. They make keratin. These are rapidly, actively dividing stem cells. They can afford to actively, rapidly divide because of their proximity to the bloodstream. Makes sense, right? If blood is going to carry oxygen and nutrients to cells and also whisk away waste, the cells that are closest to that bloodstream are going to sort of be the healthiest and able to be most active. If you're a cell far away from the bloodstream that can't really get rid of its waste, you're not going to thrive. If you're a cell far away from the bloodstream and you can't get as much oxygen, you're not going to thrive. So the closer to the dermis you get, the more the cells are going to do and make. Okay? Friction will actually stimulate these cells to divide faster. So the more you actually use a certain patch of skin, the faster these guys will divide. And when they divide, they push the old cell up. So the newest cells sort of stay on the bottom and they push the old cells up towards the surface. Okay? Now, all of your skin will do this to an extent. On your hands and your feet, you have an additional special cell layer that will form what you think of as a callus. That's its own separate skin layer that has its own sort of stimulation that helps create it. But all of your skin will become a little thicker with friction, just not calloused exactly. They produce keratin, which we've talked about as waterproofing and toughening agent. Keratin creation, so the creation of keratin, these guys are always making keratin, leads to nuclear destruction. The more keratin a cell has, the fewer nuclei you find in that layer of cells. The accumulation of keratin actively degrades the nuclear envelope and DNA. Now, that doesn't sound great, but it's actually pretty harmless. So you've got a bunch of layers of skin, right? And sort of beneficial. So you have a bunch of layers of skin and you start making keratin here. And then you divide and you have here some. And you're going to keep making more and more and more keratin with these cells as they get closer to the skin. Now, by the time you get up through here and you start making additional stuff to help toughen the skin, your cells are going to stop really meaningfully dividing. You'll accumulate keratin to the point where you can't afford the space to have a DNA or a nucleus. And if you're in the business of losing these cells anyway, what's the point in maintaining metabolism or a nucleus? There is no point. So when you get closer to the surface of the skin, you find that these sort of dead, spent skin cells are really just bags of keratin and glycoproteins. They no longer have any nucleus or any kind of metabolic activity because they don't need it. You're going to lose it anyway, so who cares if you keep it? These basal cells are also the cells that produce vitamin D upon exposure to UV radiation. They have, because they're starting to produce keratin, they serve as a bit of a water sealant and a physical barrier to infection. It's another layer for things to have to penetrate past in order to get into the body if you're a pathogen. Let's talk about melanocytes. These are also found in the stratum basale, in the basal layer. These represent anywhere from 10 to 25% or so of your total cells in the basal layer. If you have very dark colored skin, it's more like 25. If you're very light, it's more like 10. If you are albino, then you have closer to 0, but that's really the exception rather than the rule. These cells, obviously, make melanin. They are a cell site that makes melanin. The melanin is a UV protective molecule. It absorbs UV radiation so that it can't damage your skin. So it can't damage your DNA. When UV radiation hits a cell and your DNA is exposed to it, what it can do is it'll break apart. Let's unzip that DNA, and we have DNA. It'll break things apart and erase nucleotides here or there. Now, a couple things are going to happen. Your cell is going to go, oh snap, we got hurt, and go into overdrive trying to fix it. And whenever we rush to fix things, both humans and cells, whenever you go to rush to fix things, you don't do as good of a job as if you took your time and were careful, right? So this panicky patch job will often result in maybe the wrong nucleotide being put down or some other similar error. Alternately, when the cell goes to divide, you have this empty space here, right? So when this cell or when this strand of DNA is replicated, it's going to be missing this layer, and let's pretend this is A, T, C, G, A, T. There was a C there, G, A, T, C. Instead of going A, T, C, G, or T, A, G, C in the complementary line, it'll just go T, A, C. It'll skip this entirely, and you now have a frame shift of all these letters. They're all now up one, which can have really severe consequences. More often than not, it just results in the death of the cell or no change at all, depending on where it is, but it can predispose the cell to be more likely to develop cancer. Melanin, the melanin molecule, protects your cells from UV radiation by absorbing the energy in that UV radiation so that it can't damage your DNA. You see these long spindly arms? This is a melanocyte with its long spindly arms. It makes its melanin and packages it up into little vesicles, and then they travel all the way down the lengths of these arms and fill them more or less. They travel along actin, that actin skeleton immediately deep to the cell surface. And these arms effectively end up surrounding the other cells in those bottom layers, those deep layers of skin, so that when sunlight blasts down, you have a layer of melanin packed in here so that this nucleus remains safe. Now, there's an inverse relationship between the melanin content of your skin and your ability to create vitamin D. Keratinocytes are unique in that they not only make vitamin D, but they also make have the right enzymatic machinery to metabolize the vitamin D that they make into stuff that your body can really meaningfully use, the metabolites of vitamin D. So they make vitamin D and breaks it down to usable form. Okay? You actually get most of your vitamin D this way. This is partly why, having less sunlight, less sun exposure in the wintertime can really take such a toll on us and our bone health ultimately. It's because we get so much of our vitamin D from the sun. What we use from the sun to make this vitamin D, the energy we get, comes from UV radiation. So if you have more melanocytes, which absorb UV radiation, you now have less available UV radiation to make vitamin D. Interesting, huh? Now, if you have a lot of melanin, you're still certainly capable of making vitamin D. It's just the sun isn't going to cause you to produce it at the same rate as somebody who has less melanin in their skin. This means that if you have darker skin, you need to consume more vitamin D per pound of body mass than somebody with lighter skin. Otherwise, you risk, vitamin D can result in a depression of mood a little bit, but it's also the essential molecule to help get calcium into your bones. You can eat all the calcium you want day in and day out, but if you don't get any vitamin D with it, the calcium doesn't have any way to actually deposit itself in your bones to strengthen them. Vitamin D deficiency is very strongly linked to osteoporosis, even when calcium consumption remains high. So it's really important that you keep that those levels up. And in the winter time, most of us, in these northern climates where we are now, most of us need to supplement our vitamin D no matter what our skin tone. When you have things like freckles or moles, they represent a concentration of melanocytes. You just have more melanocytes packed into a single little spot. Melanin, as I mentioned earlier, migrates along actin fibers in these spidery arms, so that ultimately all of your dividing keratinocytes end up surrounded by a spidery arm of melanin. The keratinocytes will then engulf melanin particles. So you have all these spidery arms that come out and surround all of your keratinocytes. So they're nice and happy and pretty well protected. Then they will also engulf some of that melanin into themselves and bring that closer to their own nucleus. So while the melanocyte is splayed out with all of those melanin-filled dendrites, it's helping protect the keratinocytes by effectively surrounding. And the keratinocytes can pull that melanin in and wrap it around its own nucleus to best protect itself. It's sort of a dual function or a dual protective mechanism. Dendritic cells are phagocytic. Take a minute and try to remember what phagocytic might mean. Phago is eating. Cyte refers to cell. So it's a cell that eats things. These are very spidery looking and very, very, very extensive. So the melanocytes really branched out quite a bit in between other cells and had these long sort of dendritic extensions. Dendrites put those guys to shame. You have a big sort of major body of the cell here, and then they stretch way, 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 way out between lots and lots of cells so that ultimately every cell is touched by at least one arm of one of these dendritic cells. They're not mobile. They don't move around. They are resident cells of the skin, and they reside in the stratum basale as well as the stratum spinosum, but mostly the spinosum. The spinosum is this next layer superficial to the basal cell layer. Finally, in the basal layer, you have certain tactile cells. We're going to focus here on Merkel cells. These interact with nerve endings and help feel mechanical sensations like pressure and what you register as a normal touch. So you see this cell right here. Okay, that's one of your Merkel cells, and this right here below it that I'm sort of scribbling in and now I'm about to erase is a nerve ending. It's a sensory nerve. So when your Merkel cell gets squished, it can release certain chemicals to stimulate this nerve and fire off a signal to your brain. As I mentioned in the last slide, the next superficial layer is the stratum spinosum. This is moderately thick. You have probably like 10 or 12 layers of this tops. And when the keratinocytes from the basal layer divide and they're pushed superficially, they make this layer. So all of these guys in here are basically old basal cells. And the basal ones are new. The cells are attached to one another and the stratum basal by desmosomes. So if you remember what desmosomes do, what those junctions do is they kind of attach cells together like Velcro, right? You have one cell, here's one cell membrane, and another cell membrane, and you have sort of a plaque on one side, on the inside of one cell, and the inside of the other cell, and they both secrete fibers into the intercellular space and get sort of tangled here in the middle. What that means is that these two cells are pretty well secured next to one another, but they do have some give. When you push on your skin, it doesn't just tear. It moves a little bit and can bounce back. You've got collagen fibers to help with that, elastic fibers, and these desmosomes also help with that process. Intermediate keratinous filaments attach to desmosomes. So on the inside of those desmosomes, you have intermediate filaments that are made of keratin. Remember, when we talked about cytoskeleton, the intermediate filaments can be made of a lot of different things. In your skin, they're made up of keratin. So you started making keratin, I'll get that yellow back because I like the contrast, down here. Oops, let's try that again. Here we go. You started making keratin down here, and as your cells divide and old ones get pushed up, they're making keratinous filaments. They're making keratin into strands, and those are your intermediate filaments, and they attach to the desmosomes. The process I should point out of making keratin is called cornification. Anytime you see like corn or cute, like cutaneous, you're going to think keratin. They both refer to keratin. Melanin attaches to those keratinous intermediate filaments. That's partly how the melanin gets brought into the keratinocyte. So remember, you have a melanocytic arm right here next to a keratinocyte. And the melanin, or the melanocyte, brought its little packets of melanin up through, along actin, up through its big spidery arms. The keratinocyte has these these intermediate keratinous filaments forming a cytoskeleton, and that little melanin packet can travel along the keratinous cytoskeleton. Let me erase that. These cells are still fairly close to the connective tissue underneath, so they still receive nutrients. Therefore, they still divide, although very slowly and infrequently, grow, develop, etc. Because they have access to the bloodstream, they can still do stuff. There's going to come a point where your skin cells are completely divorced from your bloodstream. It can't get oxygen from it, it can't dump off waste, it can't get nutrients from it, and they're just going to have to be dead as doornails. But in the meantime, in the stratum spinosum, you're still close enough that you can still access the bloodstream. Next up, we have the stratum granulosum. You can see right here, it's not very thick, is it? It's no more than 5 layers tops. You may have fewer. So your stratum basal was just this very first single layer of cells. All of this stuff was your stratum spinosum. You have, like 10, 12, 15 layers of those. And then you have the granulosum. These are also known as granular cells. And the reason they're called granular cells in the stratum granulosum is because when you look at them really closely under a microscope, they're filled with lots and lots of little dots, little granules that are made of keratohyalin. This is a cysteine and histidine rich protein that binds to your keratin intermediate fibers in your cells, and they bind them and form sort of sheets instead of strings. So before, you had your keratinocyte, and you had sort of this cytoskeletal architecture of keratin. Now you're going to make these granules of keratohyalin, and you're going to end up with sort of more like a sheet. You see how these get packed in? You're going to end up with sheets of this molecule. So what you're doing is you're effectively starting to fill this cell with keratin. Okay? Now, because of that, right, you remember what keratin does to the nucleus? Breaks it down, right? So here you're going to start to lose nucleus meaningfully. These cells also make lamellar granules, which are glycolipids. This should tell you that they have a sugary compound as well as fatty. They have a sort of also have like a waxy kind of a consistency, and they provide extracellular waterproofing. So on the inside of your keratinocyte, you're starting to make these sheets of keratin. Those strings are basically getting thicker and bigger, and it's secreting like a waxy stuff on the outside. Now, things that are coming up from the bloodstream need to be water soluble. By surrounding the cell in a glycolipid, fatty, waxy molecule, you are now cutting off the cell from access to the bloodstream. So these cells are going to die. The plasma membrane begins to thicken, and the lipid bilayer gets replaced with what's called a ceramide, which is waxy. You see ceramide sometimes advertised in like lotions and stuff, especially heavy-duty ones, because it helps waterproof and toughen the cells as well. So you have this like triple whammy. You have a bunch more keratin, and it's kind of like in bigger, thicker sheets. You have a fatty layer, and the lipid bilayer is turning to wax. You can see how it's not going to let the cell survive very well. And therefore, between having that excess of keratin and just not being able to get any nutrients in or wastes out, both the nucleus and the organelles of your skin cells start to break down. Let's take a look at the slide a little bit. You have here's a basal cell. You have a big nucleus right in here. Nice big nucleus. This is a big, happy, active dividing cell. When you look in here, you can still see nuclei. Not in every single one. That's sort of an artifact of how you slice these sections. But you can see there's one that looks like it's maybe actively dividing. And here's a big old nucleus. You see them abundantly. Up here, you have a couple things going on. First of all, you have so much stuff, protein and fatty-based stuff going on, that it attracts dye very, very richly. So it ends up looking like this big, thick, dark stripe. But secondly, you don't really see a lot of discrete cells. Like here's one over here, but you just sort of have like an empty space. You've got a little bit of a nucleus over here and over here. It is sparse, right? The nucleus is dying, the nucleus is being broken down, the organelles are being broken down, the cells are becoming filled with waterproofing, toughening keratin, they're getting surrounded by a fatty layer, the lipid bilayer is getting replaced by basically a wax, a ceramide. This is all going to contribute to the usefulness of the outermost layers of your skin, but they're not alive anymore. The next layer is the stratum lucidum. It's referred to as lucidum because on a microscope, it looks translucent. You're going to find that in cells and in histology, a lot of times things are named by how they look under the microscope. This is also only about 3 to 5 layers or so, and it's only visible in thick skin, so places where you can develop a callus, the palms of your hand, the soles of your feet. You can't develop calluses other places. You can get thickened skin, toughened skin other places, Like with just regular old friction, it can become thicker and tougher, but it's not properly a callus unless you have the stratum lucidum. Here, the keratinocytes are dead, clear, hence the translucency, and the individual keratinocytes are fairly thick. Finally, the superficial most layer of your skin is the stratum corneum. Remember, anytime you see that corn or CUT, cute for cutaneous, you think keratin. This is anywhere between 15 to 20 layers thick, although it can be more if you've in skin that experiences a lot of friction. It's the part that you see and touch and feel. It's the outermost, most superficial layer of skin. These cells are flat. Look how nice and big and bubbly these cells are. Boom, 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 and then they get a little flatter. And then they're like pretty flat. And now up here, like you can't even tell where one cell starts and the other begins. They're just packed up like shingles. So they're flat, they have no nucleus, they get no nutrition from the bloodstream, so they are dead. They've been dead for a while. They're filled with keratin. They have that outer sort of glycolipid coating, and their plasma membrane has turned to ceramides, it's turned to wax. These cells, now that they're big, flat, and dead, are called corneocytes. Again, that refers to keratin. And even in normal day-to-day life, without doing anything extra, you slough off 50,000 of these cells a minute. They are very, very, very densely packed on the surface of your skin, and you've got a lot of them. This is most of your skin cells are these dead packed shingles of keratin. So you can see, look how thick this is. You can see how you can afford to lose a few layers, and you're fine. Your bloodstream's all the way down here. Your living cells, the ones that are practically dividing and doing stuff, are all the way down here. You can afford to lose an awful lot.